There is a tree that turns deserts into food, and for that very reason, people burned it, plowed it under, and called it a weed. In the high heat of a summer afternoon, a mesquite will look like a small miracle. Its branches spread low and spare, spiny at the edges, leaves closing like hands when the sun grows fierce. Beneath those branches, the air tastes different, cooler, shaded, faintly sweet with the memory of pods drying in the light. Out there, where rain is a rumor and soil is thin and salty, mesquite keeps a small pantry of calories and life. It does not ask for tillage, it does not wait to be planted, and for that independence it has been alternately prized, ignored, and persecuted. This is the paradox at the center of its story. A plant that feeds and heals the land by doing the very thing modern agriculture finds unacceptable. It simply persists. Long before the plow crossed the plains and barbed wire divided range from range, mesquite belonged to people who paid close attention to places where things could be coaxed into abundance. For centuries, communities across arid and semi-arid regions lived in relationship with trees and shrubs that did not obey the calendar of annual crops. Mesquite's pods, long honey-brown catkins filled with sweet dusty pulp, became a food source, a flavor, an ingredient woven into seasonal cycles of harvest and storage. People gathered under its shade, ground the pods into meal or sweetener, and used the wood for cooking and shelter. These were not fleeting practices of desperation. They were forms of stewardship shaped by observation. Where mesquite grew, shade held moisture, wind-blown soil slowed, and human hands intervened to harvest rather than eradicate. That long relationship is easiest to imagine when you imagine the taste. Imagine flour that smells of roasted nuts and caramel, thickened with the dust of pods and baked into flat cakes whose sweetness needs no sugar. Imagine a cup of water warmed over coals and laced with a broth made from toasted mesquite beans. The sensory vocabulary is simple because the uses are simple. The pods can be eaten directly in times of scarcity, roasted to bring out sugars, or ground for porridge and bread like loaves. They could be fed to animals too. Cattle and goats would browse in mesquite shade, and pods became a supplement in lean seasons. Across different territories, different communities developed recipes and storage strategies that made mesquite an integrated part of survival and taste. Then outsiders arrived with different priorities. The first explorers and settlers who wrote about the landscape often carried with them a set of expectations. Plowable fields, straight lines, flocks and herds moving in patterns they could control. A landscape thick with woody perennials looked messy, even hostile, to those whose idea of productive land required clearing and fencing. Mesquite was too stubborn. It resprouted from roots, sent shoots where it was cut, and encircled plots that newcomers wanted open. It resisted the tidy geometry of property. So it became a symbol of wilderness to be tamed, of land that needed improvement. That labeling was not neutral. In regions where ranching became dominant, mesquite stood between cattle and the grass they were meant to eat. In lands converted to annual commodity crops, mesquite's root systems and shade interfered with the iron logic of mechanized plows and harvesters. Eradication programs followed economic incentives. Clearing mesquite made way for pastures or fields fully compatible with purchased seed, fertilizer, and machines. Governments and private interests funded or encouraged removal campaigns, sometimes with chemical and mechanical tools designed to exterminate what had been a food-bearing and soil-holding companion. Over time, cultural memory shifted. What had once been a pantry became a nuisance. What had been a source of nourishment became an emblem of a past people were pushed to forget. Specific policies, laws, and local ordinances that accelerated this process are complex and varied by place, and many of the finer historical details require further sourcing. There is a violence to this kind of erasure that is both ecological and cultural. When a plant is removed from the landscape en masse, the work of memory is done for it. Recipes spoil in the absence of ingredients. Seasonal practices fail to transmit when the resource disappears. The language used to describe a landscape changes from names rooted in use to names that rate it by commodity value. Communities that had relied on mesquite for food, fuel, and a host of other uses found their lifeways devalued. At the same time, the land itself suffered. Mesquite's roots reach deep. In places it shades and stabilizes soil, interrupts wind scour, and, some argue, improves soil fertility through relationships with soil microbes. When those roots are torn out and the surface left open to wind and sun, erosion can increase. The very measures meant to increase grazing capacity or crop acreage sometimes produced long-term brittleness in the soil, requiring more inputs to keep the same yield. We should pause on a simple truth. Perennials like mesquite operate on a different timetable than annual commodity systems. They invest in structure, deep roots, woody trunks, symbiotic microbial relationships that pay back slowly and in different currencies. Shade, carbon stored deeper in the soil, biomass left after drought, and food that does not require an annual purchase of seed. They resist the logic of seasonal planting and harvesting because their persistence undermines the need for a constant market for seed, fertilizer, and credit. That resilience looks like stubbornness to a system built on turnover and control. Stories of survival tend to focus on dramatic episodes: wars, famines, sudden collapse. With perennial species, survival often looks less like singular drama and more like long-term insurance. In several documented cases of communities turning to native or naturalized perennials during times of scarcity, these plants buffered food supplies and provided alternatives when markets or crops failed. Whether mesquite performed such a role in particular crises and exactly how communities adapted it for those moments needs careful historical digging. What we can say with confidence is that plants which persist without input were and are a form of security, quietly present during drought, sprouting from roots when seed stalks are gone, offering both fuel and sustenance. Part of the reason mesquite became stigmatized was rhetorical as much as practical. The language we use, weed, nuisance, invader, carries a moral charge. A weed is not merely a plant out of place. It is a problem to be solved, often with a story of human failure attached. The landowner who allowed their pasture to become filled with woody brush, the ranch that neglected rotational grazing, the farmer who did not invest in weed control. Labeling mesquite a weed made its eradication seem not only rational but virtuous, a cleansing of the landscape to make way for the modern ideal of productive, owned land. But that narrative obscures questions of value. Who benefits from the cleared land? Who loses access to a food source that was once common and free? And what ecological functions are traded away in the process? Ecologically, mesquite offers a suite of services that are now being re-examined. Its deep root systems reach moisture that annuals never touch, helping it persist through drought and sometimes bringing water and nutrients closer to the surface for other plants. Its foliage and leaf drop build organic matter, and its wood resists decay, making it valuable for fuel and long-lasting construction in contexts where timber is scarce. The pods themselves are food, sweet, starchy, and capable of being dried into meal with a long shelf life. In recent years, chefs and foragers have rediscovered these flavors, teasing out smoky molasses notes from toasted mesquite flour and using it to flavor breads, sauces, and glazes. Permaculture designers point to mesquite as a species that can provide shade, animal forage, and food for people on low-input systems, especially in arid and semi-arid climates. Here, we find an important nuance. Mesquite is not universally beneficial in every ecological context. In areas where grassland is the desired ecosystem for grazing, unchecked mesquite can convert open rangeland into shrubland, changing the habitat and the species it supports. where it spreads rapidly into formerly grass-dominated places, sometimes in response to overgrazing, altered fire regimes, or climate shifts. It can become seen as an encroacher. These dynamics are complex and often the product of multiple interacting factors: grazing pressure, fire suppression, water availability, and human land management. The point is not to cast mesquite as unambiguously good or bad, but to show that its role depends on context and on the priorities we set for land. Often, the decision to remove mesquite is as much an economic choice as an ecological one. To understand why industrial agriculture pushed perennials out, imagine an economy that revolves around the annual sale of seed, herbicide, and fertilizer. Annual row crops create a steady demand for those goods. Perennials cut into that flow. A perennial that reproduces from rootstock and requires minimal inputs undermines a model that depends on continual purchase and control. Mechanization plays its part too. Tractors, combines, and large-scale irrigation expect a field to behave predictably, to be free of woody obstacles, and to conform to tidy rows. Mesquite interrupts that predictability. It demands different technology, different labor practices, and a different relationship to risk. In short, mesquite's very thriftiness makes it incompatible with a system premised on turnover and external inputs. Yet this same thriftiness is increasingly being valued in a world facing hotter summers, longer droughts, and the limits of fossil fuel-dependent inputs. Restoration ecologists and permaculturalists are asking different questions. How might trees and shrubs that anchor soil and shade microclimates help communities adapt to aridity? How can a landscape that supports both perennial food and wildlife be designed so that human and non-human needs overlap? In local markets and test kitchens, there is a growing appetite for flavors and foods that tell a story of place, of resilience, of flavors that connect to ancestral practices. Mesquite flour, smoked mesquite salts, and mesquite syrup are appearing on menus and in farmers markets not as nostalgic curiosities, but as ingredients with viable culinary potential. Names and timelines of commercial products may require sourcing. Alongside chefs, community projects and grassroots groups are experimenting with mesquite in regenerative systems, using plants to stabilize eroded gullies, to provide shade for young saplings, to create living fences that double as food. Scientists are studying root depth, drought responses, and the role of woody perennials in carbon capture, research that may help us understand where mesquite belongs in a future landscape designed for resilience rather than extraction. Details of specific studies and data points require citation. When people begin to reclaim an old food, the process is cultural as much as agricultural. Reviving mesquite requires learning to harvest without damaging ecosystems, to process pods into safe flour, to establish markets that pay harvesters fairly, and to relearn recipes and taste preferences that have faded. It also requires listening to indigenous knowledge holders whose land care practices preserved these plants for generations. That listening must be more than appropriation. It means entering into agreements of respect, credit, and reciprocity. Some revival efforts do this well, partnering with indigenous entrepreneurs and community organizations, documenting recipes, and creating shared stewardship models. But others can slip into extractive patterns that repeat older errors. Any revival must be humble about the plant's complexity and the communities whose memory it embodies. There are small, practical options for those who want to engage responsibly. Learn who the local knowledge holders are and support their businesses. Look for community forage programs that operate with permission and ecological awareness. Attend workshops on perennial management that emphasize habitat and soil health. And consider how small-scale plantings, when done with community consent and ecological planning, might provide shade, food, and erosion control. Avoid romanticizing foraging on private land or trespassing in the name of discovery. The work of restoration is social as well as ecological. It asks that we rebuild relationships between people and place. At the level of the table, mesquite's flavors are direct and immediate. Toasted and ground, its pods become a sweet, nutty flour that complements corn or wheat. Used as smoke, its wood imparts a rich, caramelized note to meats and vegetables. These culinary applications tie the plant to memory in an intimate way. A taste can reawaken a practice, and a practice can reweave a social relation. But taste alone won't reverse centuries of policy and land use change. Turning deserts into lasting food systems will require policy choices that value perennial infrastructure, investment in processing technologies that make mesquite flour commercially viable at scale, and economic models that reward stewardship rather than short-term clearing. The story of mesquite is, at heart, a story about choices. We have long chosen to privilege control over resilience, uniformity over mixture, and short-term yield over long-term stability. Those choices shaped landscapes and lives, silenced plant knowledge, and reshaped ecosystems to fit a narrow idea of productivity. Recovering mesquite as a useful, edible, and ecological ally is not simply about planting trees. It is about widening the definition of what counts as food and asking whether we will design systems that allow life to persist without constant purchase and intervention. We face a practical, moral question. Do we want landscapes that demand us to dominate them, or landscapes that invite partnership? Mesquite has always offered the latter. It asks for conversation more than command. It feeds where other plants fail, shelters in the worst heat, and stores value below ground where it is less visible to the short-term eye. If the past century's insistence on control erased its place, the next decades might reframe it as an asset for a world learning to do more with less. If this story resonates, subscribe for more vaults of forgotten foods and the people who steward them. As you close this chapter, imagine standing beneath a mesquite at dusk. The air cools, the leaves whisper. Someone hands you a piece of flatbread dusted with toasted pod flour. The taste is sweet and smoky, familiar and strange. That small act, to eat, to share, to remember, is revolutionary in its own way. It acknowledges that abundance does not always arrive packaged and billed, that the ground can hold a pantry if we simply pay attention, and that some of our most resilient allies were labeled weeds because they refuse to be owned. If you want to act, learn who holds local knowledge and support their work. Explore recipes that use mesquite thoughtfully. And, where restoration is happening, join efforts that prioritize ecological context and community consent. Share this story with someone curious about foods that survived where others failed. The choices we make about what to tend or to throw away are, in the end, choices about what kind of future we want to live in. Note: several specific historical events, legal edicts, nutritional analyses, and detailed ethnographic practices related to mesquite are not fully specified here, and should be verified with primary sources or indigenous authored materials before use in scholarly or journalistic reporting.